I think now the balance of power is shifting. And now Russia increasingly and quite visibly during the forum becomes one of the, or maybe the most important member of this Chinese orchestrated initiative, rather than a fully autonomous player that is having a say on how things run in Eurasia.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW interview. Today I'm talking to Jakub Jakubowski, the Deputy Director of OSW. We'll be discussing China's Belt and Road Initiative. Hi, Jakub.
Hello.
Today we want to discuss the current state of progress of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Before we begin, could we go over the history of it? It's about 10 years old. It was termed the New Silk Road. So where did it come from and what was it initially designed to be?
Well, in terms of the story of now it's called the Belt and Road Initiative. Then before it used to be called the One Belt, One Road and the New Silk Road, lots of different names and labels. I think this reflects the kind of chaotic and changing nature of this whole project. It's been indeed announced by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan in 2013, so roughly 10 years ago. In fact, we had the 10th anniversary this September. And at the time when he was in Astana proclaiming this grand project, nobody really knew what this whole thing is about. And I think it was made on purpose. I mean, even inside China, nobody knew what this really means. But this reveals the true nature of how China approaches this kind of big projects. It worked out like that internally with many political campaigns, and also now for the first time externally with this grand vision that Xi Jinping has laid out that was only then to be filled with actual contents. And this is actually how it works and still works up until this day for every Chinese major initiative. You had the big framing laid out by the supreme leader, and then a number of internal actors in China, central government, state-owned companies, local governments, all trying to come up with the actual content. And then Xi Jinping and the Central Party leadership just assembles people after some time and picks good ideas and kills bad ideas. And this is how actually the Belt and Road Initiative came into being and then evolved along the way.
Could you give us an idea of, because it sounds a little like a caprice of Xi Jinping, what was behind his thought process at the time? He must have thought it would give China some advantages.
Well, I think, first of all, he needed a big international thing that was his. I think, and indeed, it was the first project of that scale that China has invented and proposed to the world. That's how the Chinese like to frame it. A kind of a proposition that other countries can contribute to. And this stems from this larger narrative of China bringing to the world new ideas, more equal world order, where everybody can basically contribute. On the level of narratives, this is how it was presented. Xi Jinping needed his signature big international project also to show that he is different from previous leaders that were more inward-looking. But in terms of the actual shape that the Belt and Road Initiative took along the way, I think two elements are important here. First of all, the geographical scope. So we had Xi Jinping in Astana in 2013, and a few months after that date, he went to Indonesia and proclaimed another branch of the Silk Road, which was the maritime Silk Road, both joining different parts of Eurasia at the beginning, mostly adjacent regions, but then it evolves into a truly global initiative. I think this stems from an idea of China trying to reach out to its immediate periphery, to kind of stabilize it, to forge some economic and social and political links, to get some additional political leverage there. It then exploded into a truly global initiative. I think even Xi Jinping was overwhelmed by the excitement it caused, but also significant resistance from established world powers. But then comes the second element, which is the economic logic of it. And I think there's no coincidence that the Belt and Road Initiative was so focused on infrastructure, and especially hard infrastructure. Because if we go back to the 2013, we have China that's at the very peak of the biggest infrastructural push inside China since basically ever. That is, in 2008 world financial crisis, China has decided to stimulate the economy massively through infrastructural investments, building up production capacity of steel, of concrete, all kinds of components that are needed to build highways, airports, ports, and so on. And by 2012, I think the Chinese leadership started to understand that this cannot go on internally forever, because the capacity is so huge and the number of investments is so huge that it is actually already causing some problems inside China. So I think the idea was to kind of divert this huge capacity outside.
And what kind of problems was it creating inside China?
The same set of problems that it's created outside China later on. That is, once again, it's good to think of it as a kind of a political campaign. It's not a rational project assessment pipeline when you have long-term assessments of profitability, sustainability, and so on. At that time, China desperately needed to go fast with big spending, and so they did. And in a way, inside China for 2 or 3 decades, you could be actually sure that if you build an airport or a new city somewhere, it will be filled with new people and businesses, and actually you'll be able to repel debts. Yeah, and it worked like that in China for many years. But right after the global financial crisis, when this push was so huge, it started to be clear for the Chinese leadership that something's not working. That they've created a lot of debt, especially on the local level. The local governments got really saturated with new debt, all owned to the Chinese state-owned banks, but a considerable overhang nevertheless. And these debts cannot get repaid because the actual economic activity generated by it was not sustainable. And I think this is one of the big problems China has encountered in other parts of the world too. As the very same set of stakeholders, these are the very same banks, the very same construction companies were encouraged very strongly by Xi Jinping to just go out, and so they did. And we saw a massive upsurge in the Chinese debt funded infrastructure spending, especially in the global south. This is how we should think of it. China has directed this primarily at the developing world. And although in some parts of Europe you could still find people thinking that the Belt and Road Initiative is about linking Europe and China, but in fact it was always mostly about the global south.
So it sounds like Xi Jinping told these same stakeholders, go out and make the same mistakes again. But there must have been some successes. It's been going on for 10 years. Was this infrastructure built? Is it being used? And has it helped China's status as a global power? Has the global south turned to China? And is it more dependent on China now?
Well, definitely, yes. I mean, there's been a lot of international recognition for China. I think if the international recognition as China as a global power then can offer something that the world was on Xi Jinping's mind at the beginning, and I think it was. He really got a lot out of it. I mean, we had the whole world talking about Chinese ideas and visions and money for roughly a decade. And I think purely diplomatically speaking, I think he succeeded in that. Then when it comes to actual projects, I think the results are just mixed. We are talking about tens of different types of countries, political systems, different environments in terms of what's needed in terms of infrastructure. So I think you could find countries that actually had an idea on what to build and what's profitable, and then the Chinese approaching with a lot of money, often a bit cheaper than the Western money. Mm-hmm. This applies especially to countries that had some economic or political problems. China, admittedly, didn't care that much about the political circumstances, just was eager to lend money. Actually, that was one of the strongest Chinese talking points. It was like, we are different from the West because the West tells you to change, to enact reforms, to pursue certain democratic agenda, and we just don't care if you're democratic or not. We just bring development. And this kind of approach got some resonance in many parts of the global South.
Did this not create a lot of corruption, though?
The way the Chinese operate inside China is very corrupt, and so this extends to the outside world too. But it all depends on the specific country. If you had countries with well-established systems of fighting corruption, pretty transparent and so on, then China tended to operate under the conditions that it met, and while it was the capital was corrosive itself, as it's been called. There are countries where the Chinese money was flowing in, but not resulting in a big, upsurge in systemic corruption. Mm-hmm. But then there were countries, and especially elites within countries, that really treated this as a way to fill their own coffers. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that the model that the Chinese have offered had this as a feature, because for every big project there will be 10 or 15% of the procurement being assigned to local companies. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it were like local champions being assigned in a transparent way, but very often in many countries, but even in Europe, like in Hungary, you could have a crony of a leader getting this money. And by that, the Chinese started to kind of plug themselves into certain local corruption/political schemes.
Mm-hmm. 10 years on, it sounds like there are certain problems with the project. How is it doing at the moment? Is there room for China to be optimistic or very pessimistic?
Well, we've seen the third Belt and Road Forum being held in Beijing several weeks ago, and I think it's a good indicator of where the project is heading. I mean, China has hit considerable roadblocks in terms of the model it applied. Some of it comes from the problems we already talked about. So local economies throughout the developing world being saturated with Chinese debt. Mm-hmm. This has been especially acute during COVID, when lots of export revenues fell. Then the interest rates in the US went up. And this is an interesting point because the Chinese were lending money in US dollars, mm-hmm. and not the Chinese renminbi.
Why?
I mean, it's complicated, but generally China wants to keep the flow of renminbi under strict control. Mm-hmm. So it's not fully convertible. So many of the recipient countries didn't want really to draw loans in renminbi because it's a problematic currency. But then China has an extremely big current account surplus, so trade mm-hmm. surplus and other types of surpluses. So it needed to recycle this US dollars so as not to allow renminbi to appreciate too much. A bit complicated economic kind of setting, but the bottom line is most of that money, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being lent, were lent in US dollars mm-hmm. with variable exchange rate. Mm-hmm. So somehow linked to the monetary situation in the US. And as the US has hiked up the interest rates for many of the countries that lend money from China in US dollars, the debt became a huge problem. Mm-hmm. And this is basically where we are in now. I mean, China is still lending money mm-hmm. for new projects, but the majority of the new types of lending to the developing world is actually debt rescheduling, consolidation, some macroeconomic relief. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I mean, this is a problem that like followed every major upsurge in global development of finance. I mean, in 1970s and 80s, the Gulf was so flooded with money coming from rising oil exports. It started to lend it throughout the world, and then you had a flood of defaults, debt problems throughout the world. This is how it works when you have a lot of cheap capital, and China had a lot of it, and it flows and it flows, and nobody really thinks about what will happen if things go bad, and then you have this kind of thing. So I don't think it's a kind of specifically Chinese thing. It's just a thing that all major lenders, international lenders, encounter at some point, and so they did, and I think they're fully aware of it. And this Belt and Road Forum that they've organized in Beijing was kind of pretty openly saying that the model needs to change. That hard infrastructure is important, but maybe let's talk about softer infrastructure, cyber infrastructure like optic fibers, 5G, digitalization, and so on. And then industrial capacity cooperation. That is another thing that China has tried to pitch to the countries in the global south, that is involving the global south in Chinese value chains. So like moving away from a model where China lent a lot of money, often for hard infrastructure, leading to huge raw materials deposits in the global south, out of it towards a more, as they say, green, sustainable, both financially and environmentally, projects with considerably lower threshold of lending, because I think everybody found out it's unsustainable to keep it on such a high level.
You mentioned defaults and the restructuring of loans. Is it putting a strain on the Chinese banking system at all?
I mean, the system itself is pretty insulated. We're talking about two banks, in particular, China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. They have an access to liquidity, to US dollars and renminbi. So it's not that acute in terms of the banking system itself. Of course, this debt overhang is considerable, but I think the whole Chinese system, financial system, I like the distinction between a financial market and a financial sector, because you don't have a financial market in China because it's not market driven. It's a sector that is under direct control of the state, and so the state can stabilize it on a whim. So because it has control over decisions here, I don't think this is the main problem. The main problem is the actual know-how that China still lacks on how to deal with this kind of problems when you have countries hugely dependent on your financial flows that encounter some serious troubles. You need money for emergency relief to stabilize foreign currencies, to stabilize foreign governments and budgets and so on. And this is a kind of a big power toolbox that China needs to build. And if you look at the U.S. or the established Western lenders, when you have the IMF that comes in right after there's a debt crisis and trying to kind of solve it, it's a controversial way, but it's at least a comprehensive system. In China's case, I think they're still learning on how to cope with that, while still trying to be a different kind of power than the West is, and it's increasingly hard to do this.
Okay, so definitely it's encountering some problems, the project. Have they been noticed by the outside world, or especially the participants from, let's say, the Global South? Are they still enthusiastic about this initiative?
Well, the Global South is a huge category of very different regions and countries and settings. I generally feel that how the Global South is being in relationship with China has been covered in international media is that it's very often deprived of agency, And in many cases, those local elites are very experienced in talking with international lenders. They've been talking with international financial institutions, but they've been talking with the Gulf, they've been talking with the Japanese for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they know how to count money. And in some cases, they just saw the opportunity, they took it. And now they're, tough negotiators also with the Chinese on how to deal with that. So I think it's not that, the Global South just blindly flocked into the thing. But I think one very important element is how the West or the Global North has responded to that. Because 10 years ago, we had a, old, well-established global development lending system with, the World Bank and big international financial institutions being the kind of a legacy system, and then China coming in with new ideas on development, on building hard infrastructure, of connecting the Global South into the Chinese value chains. But now the situation is different. What China is facing now is an environment where the EU has the so-called Global Gateway, which is a kind of a European response to the Belt and Road Initiative, implementing some of the new ideas that China brought up. You had a Build Back Better world. It doesn't sound sexy, but this is what the U.S.
Difficult to remember.
Yeah. It's none of those alternatives, and this Build Back Better world is Joe Biden's idea to leverage the U.S. development money to be more flexible in terms of the needs of the Global South. We have the Japanese Qualitative Infrastructure Initiative. So the G7 is coordinating strongly on providing an alternative here, highlighting all the problems that the Chinese money brought up in terms of debt sustainability, in terms of environment, labor standards, and also appealing to some of the countries in the Global South that actually encounter these problems. So China is kind of now within the Belt and Road Initiative, it's within a much more competitive environment in terms of the development of finance. Yeah.
So I'd like to move on to a slightly different subject. China has been cooperating very closely with Russia, which has become something of an international pariah after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. How involved is Russia in this Belt and Road Initiative? Because much of the territory would pass naturally through Russia.
Well, it's first good to kind of put this Russia angle into a proper global context. Because, as I said, at the very beginning, the Belt and Road Initiative was very much focused on Central Asia and Kazakhstan and Eurasia.
Which was considered Russia's sphere of influence.
Yes, and I will get back to it. But in the meantime, it became truly global. So, in a sense, things happening between China and Russia on the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, are currently just a minor fraction of this general global agenda that China has. But of course, for the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Beijing, it is important. And at the very beginning, 2013, Moscow is very anxious about that. So they've heard, and I think they were also surprised, as everyone was, including many of the Chinese stakeholders, with Xi Jinping proclaiming this kind of thing. They were suspicious in a way. Not openly criticizing that, but kind of distancing themselves, asking the Chinese questions of what does it mean, how would this change the balance of power, I mean, as it was established in Central Asia, where Russia takes the political and security side and China takes the economic and raw material side. The bottom line here is that the Chinese and the Russians, they have a very comprehensive bilateral relationship that enables them to kind of iron out differences that appear and tensions. The tension was there, but after 2 or 3 years also of direct talks between Moscow and Beijing, the Russians started to kind of be more positive about the whole thing. They come up with their own great Eurasian space idea, so as to be on par with China and grandiose ideas. Mm-hmm. But then the kind of bandwagon on this and started to look for ways on how they can actually make money out of it. The EU-China railway connections that were one of the most visible parts of the BRI, the trains approaching, Xi Jinping going to Poland or UK, meeting those trains approaching from China. This is the one aspect of the BRI that Russia started really to profit from, servicing those trains going through the Russian landmass. I wouldn't say this really changed the balance of power between the two. If you assume that the basic paradigm of China-Russia relationship in Central Asia, which was the region we are talking about, it didn't change the balance of power that much, namely the balance in which Russia is the political security provider and China being the economic one. Although in the long term, of course, this big Chinese economic gravitational field is certainly pulling Central Asia into its orbit. But I'd like to say that I think the Russian invasion on Ukraine in 2022 has really changed this balance of, or the status quo in terms of China, Russia, and the BRI profoundly, because and you could clearly see this during the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing this year. The BRI has become a platform for Putin to interact with the global South. Mm-hmm. He's a diplomatic pariah. He's been not allowed to go to the South Africa for the BRICS summit because of the threat of being arrested. He wasn't there in the G20 summit in India because he's so conflicted with other participants. And actually, by organizing the Belt and Road Forum, when China allowed Putin to have an open speech as the only leader apart from Xi Jinping, allowed Russia to have a lot of bilateral meetings with the group of countries China has assembled, and extracting some concessions from Putin, namely, starting to openly praise the Belt and Road Initiative, repeating some of the narratives that China wants to convey to the global South. I think in a way, before the Russian invasion, and this basically applies to China-Russia relationship in broader terms. Before, they were more or less equal in terms of shaping Eurasia, and especially in connectivity and economic terms. At least Russia had a bigger say, or kind of a veto power on China did in Belarus, Ukraine, Central Asia. But I think now the balance of power is shifting. And now Russia increasingly and quite visibly during the forum becomes one of or maybe the most important member of this Chinese orchestrated initiative, rather than a fully autonomous player that is having a say on how things run in Eurasia.
Okay, very interesting. Could I ask you to make a prediction? So we've had 10 years. And they have encountered some problems despite very much initial enthusiasm. What will be in the next 10 years?
Well, first of all, China can very well phase out the project. They decided not to this year. This Belt and Road Forum was a kind of a revival of the idea that was slowly dying out because of COVID, lack of interactions, lack of international visibility, but they gave it another push. What's interesting is that they kind of trim it down to the original content, namely economics, infrastructure, connectivity, and so on, and other elements that they used to put in the BRI basket, namely security, global order, global reform of economic management, UN, and so on. They tend to kind of pull this out of this basket and launch a kind of separate initiatives. There's a global development initiative of China, a global security initiative, global cyberspace initiatives. They kind of trim it down to this original thing, which was mainly economic and connectivity related. That's a first. And as I said, they're trying to change the focus from this debt-driven big infrastructural binge into a more sustainable green cyber-oriented thing. What may change, in fact, is maybe a different economic environment, because so far, currently the debt, the interest rates in the U.S., all the problems that BRI faces may very well change. I mean, maybe in several years, if China still had a considerable surplus of dollars that it needs to recycle somewhere, and the conditions are ripe for that in the global south, they may very well kind of try to restart this. But I think in a fundamentally different manner. I think they've started to learn their lesson, the lesson that every major international lender has to learn at some point, that you need to be long-term in your thinking. You need to think about devising sustainable projects and regional approaches that can withstand for decades, rather than this kind of a short-term land build and get money back approach that it applied at the very beginning. So I think they're starting to learn their lesson.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jakub.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching this OSW interview. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with all future content.